This will be followed by a panel discussion on the theme for Tokyo to become the hub of Asia. The material can be found in your agenda, or if you can read the QR code, you'll have access to the handouts. The moderator will be editorial writer and senior staff writer of Nihon Keizai Shimbun, Mr. RYUSHIRO Kodaira. So over to you, Mr. Kodaira. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kodaira from Nippon Keizai Shimbun. Under this theme of Tokyo becoming the hub, we will have a discussion with the experts. So let me introduce the panelists. Next to me, to start with the gentleman sitting next to me, Vice Minister for Global Environmental Affairs, Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Hiroshi Ono. Next, Chief Responsible Investment Officer of Amundi, Japan, Mr. Yasunori Iwanaga. Managing Executive Officer, Head of Financial Solutions Group, MUFG Bank, Mr. Koichiro Oshima. Last but not least, First Secretary Delegation of the European Union to Japan, Ms. NORA MATEI. So I look forward to having this discussion with you. And MC will be Kodaira, RYUSHIRO Kodaira, editorial writer and senior staff writer of Nihon Keizai Shimbun. The panel and the purpose of the discussion, an overview of the discussion is what I'd like to give. As Governor Koike mentioned earlier, transition finance and the significance of that is becoming increasingly greater. The respective countries' financial cities and financial markets are being activated. Green finance and ESG investment, sustainable finance is at the core of activation of the market, and in particular in Japan and in Asia. The significance of transition finance is extremely high, according to my view. That is 2050 net zero. Toward this goal, businesses are trying to suppress the emission of greenhouse gases. They're making strenuous efforts, and finance to back this up is obviously very important. But as a reality, Japan and Asia are such that we still emit a lot of GHGs. And there are many companies which serve as the source for emission. And not investing in these companies, not investing in these technologies would lead to investors not having a destination for their investment, and the economy will go awry. And so a realistic answer to this would be, with regard to companies that invest a lot of GHG, to make investments in these companies to suppress emission, or to have them shift the investment into technology to deal with this. So the transition finance in this respect is very important, in particular in Tokyo and in Asia. That is my understanding. And the four panelists gathered here today are very suited to discuss this theme. It's a very balanced team. We have two responsible for policy in Japan and in other countries. We have a leading country, a person representing Europe, and then we have bankers and overseas asset management companies. So it's a very balanced panel that we have. So I'm looking forward to what we can hear from the panelists today. So on the first theme, transition finance is very important. And I'm sure that we all understand this. But in realistic terms, in Europe and in Japan, the present state of transition finance, what is the present status? So we'd like to have the panelists state their comments on this as an overview. We'd like to have Mr. Ono talk about the present status of transition finance as a policy, person responsible for policy.
Thank you very much. I am Ono of the MOE. Nice to be here. The importance of transition finance, especially in Japan and Asia, is as well described by Mr. Kodaira. We're aiming for carbon neutrality 2050, and by 2030, this will be a very important decade. 46% reduction is the target that Japan has submitted. And in order to achieve such ambitious goal, the economic circle, the industrial structure, lifestyle, everything has to be transformed quite drastically. And that would require enormous amount of funds. Yet, however, it's not the case that all industrial sectors can overnight decarbonize itself completely. During the few decades, there has to be a pathway of transition. Zero emission or renewable energy, there tends to be excessive focus just on those topics, but we also have to shed light on the pathway of transition and how we can provide support both in terms of financing as well as policy. And they would be the keys to achieve decarbonization. Especially in this context, when we think about transition finance in Japan, we have been one of the pioneer countries where various initiatives have already been launched quite early on. 2021 May, FSA, METI, and MOE jointly came up with the basic guidelines on climate transition finance. And thereafter, METI came up with the sectorial roadmap for large emitting sectors: steel, chemical, power, gas, oil, paper and pulp, cement. So for these 7 sectors, the roadmap was created in 2021, and currently the roadmap for the automotive sector is being prepared. The sectors that are covered by the roadmap currently accounts for close to 70% of total emissions of Japan, and when we have the automotive roadmap, it will cover more than 80%. So the roadmaps will cover quite a gigantic proportion of industrial emissions. And Paris Agreement, IEA, international initiatives or scenarios for decarbonization, and these roadmaps are well aligned, and therefore the roadmap's targets are extremely ambitious. And in the long-term strategy and global warming strategy, and the Prime Minister's office had taken the lead for the basic concept for implementation of GX. We will be supporting these initiatives through these policies and concepts. So with these initiatives, these efforts will be promoted through public-private partnership. And in 2020, we began to see sudden increase in transition finance deals. More than 20 operating companies have implemented transition finance. However, in comparison to the necessary size of the market, the trend has already begun. It's still nascent, and therefore, whole of the country efforts will have to be made to promote transition finance, and that is the phase we are in today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ono. Next, the European Union, Ms. NORA MATEI, perhaps could talk about the present status of Europe. in this area, EU is globally in a leading position with regard to rulemaking. So we can hear firsthand from someone from Europe. So I'm very excited. Ms. Matei, please.
よろしくお願いします。MATEI と言います。Thank you for the invitation to this event. Indeed, as Mr. Ono has highlighted earlier, the transition to sustainability is fundamental for the years ahead. So I'd like to give you a brief overview of what we are doing in the EU to finance the transition to a sustainable and resilient economy. If we can show slide 2. So in the EU, we have the European Green Deal, which is our new growth strategy to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. And our first major milestone down this path would be a 55% reduction of emissions by 2030. And to address this challenge, we have put in place the building block of a sustainable finance framework. Slide 3, if we can show now, please. Thank you. Sustainable finance framework, which works for the, of course, for the EU market, but which we believe is compatible with other international rules and standards. So it is made of 3 major building blocks, at the core of which rests the EU taxonomy. Then we have the rules on disclosures for both companies and investors to ensure transparency for all stakeholders. And we also have the tools to implement all these rules. For example, the EU climate benchmarks and the European Green Bond Standard proposal. What we are trying to do now is make sure that all these initiatives are consistent with one another and that they work together and that are actually usable for the financial system as a whole. So our priority at the moment is to combat greenwashing and to facilitate stakeholders' alignment with the taxonomy. If we can move now to slide 4, I would like to emphasize now the EU Transition Finance Framework, which we continue to develop. It is one of the 4 policy areas which we have targeted in our strategy for financing the transition to a sustainable economy that we published in 2021. So just to explain simply here, what we want to do here is to provide additional measures to facilitate the financing of transition efforts by companies. So this is for the big picture. Now I'd like to go a bit into detail how we position how our framework is positioned in relation to Japan's transition finance policies. So in the EU, we encourage transition finance at economic activity level, and this is the EU taxonomy approach, which Japan does not have, and at entity level, which both EU and Japan have. And for us, the taxonomy is embedded into our sustainable finance framework and is meant to interact and support other rules and policies. For example, the Green Bond Standard makes references to the taxonomy, the disclosures use taxonomy, and so on and so forth. So this is one point of difference. But let me just stress that there are important commonalities between our respective frameworks. First, our underlying principles have a lot in common. So we both the EU and Japan have the 2050 and 2030 goals and targets. Japan roadmaps aim to realize carbon neutrality by 2050, and so our taxonomy and legislation has the same goals. Both approaches are science-based and are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And of course, our approach as well is based on the results of deliberations of experts in the field. Then thirdly, both approaches are dynamic and living rules. So this is one important point because often the EU taxonomy is misinterpreted as a static rule book. It is not the case. The rules are there to be updated in line with technological progress. So as I said, we have a lot in common, and also at entity level, when we look into our respective frameworks, there are common points. Maybe details are different, but the basic stance is very similar. So both us and Japan have established similar rules. For example, on governance or on establishment of transition plans, or for example, how important it is to verify, monitor these plans, and how important it is to achieve transparency on the progress made. And last but not least, we have also common priorities in international forum. Our work in international forums, for example, in the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, we both support the global baseline standards for sustainability disclosure, which the ISSB has proposed. Here, I must say that we, in the EU, we go a bit beyond the proposal of the ISSB because our framework rests on the concept of double materiality, which is different from the ISSB proposal. But we are discussing now with the ISSB how to make our respective sets of standards work together. So how to achieve interoperability between the European and the ISSB standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very comprehensive explanation. From we've heard from the policy authorities in Japan. So based on that, on the actual financial market, there are players. We have them here as well. So we'd like to hear from them. Mr. Iwanaga from Amundi, perhaps from the perspective of asset management company, you could give an overview of the transition finance. Thank you very much. My name is Yasunori Iwanaga from Amundi, Japan. We are a European asset management company. And here in Japan, we are providing management services to Japanese clients. Transition finance and the present status is such that from the Japanese standpoint, how does Europe look from the Japanese perspective? I'd like to state on that the external environment is such that there's a great difference in awareness between Europe and Japan. And what this means is that investing in companies that have a high carbon load itself is evil. There are the groups which view things in this way. And quite recently, perhaps you've seen G funds have a lot of financial institutions, and these companies are still investing in high carbon companies, and there are very critical views of this. So within this environment, we have to deal with transition finance. And as Ms. Matei has mentioned before, the EU double materiality, and there are regulations which are organized according to this FCR regarding disclosure. There are rules regarding disclosure and EU taxonomy, and the MiFID II. Based on these rules, we have to disclose the nature of our management. And the EU taxonomy, compliant investment, what percentage of investment is compliant? This has to be disclosed as well. And so under the name transition, what could be recognized and what are environmentally sustainable? That's in EU taxonomy. And the percentage of this has to be vetted as well. And my feeling on this is that in the past, divestment started, and we started with divestment. And the present status is such that the people feel that engagement is important, and that is becoming mainstream. And so it all boils down to hard to abate sectors. They have the key to transition. And somehow we have to target, to have these companies target based on scientific basis, and we have to have them disclosed properly. And for this purpose, we conduct engagement activities, and we do that very actively. And in terms of asset management, corporate disclosure is two sides of the same coin. Awareness-aligned benchmark. This is determined within the EU. It's a new benchmark-based product. And also, up until now, The recent carbon footprint is being referenced in terms of the benchmark, and people try to reduce based on this basement. But toward 2020 and 2030, 2050, we have to look beyond to these years. And what reduction pathway is the company on, and in what way are we investing in these companies? Forward-looking investment is something that we have to promote going forward. So based on that awareness, we are tackling the issue of transition. That is all from me. Thank you very much. We'll hear from Mr. Iwanaga later to hear about the business perspective. The emblematic large Japanese banking group, MUFG Bank, has a representative with us today. Mr. Oshima, please, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Oshima from MUFG Bank. Thank you for inviting me. From my side, I would like to talk about Japan and Asia's transition finance, its current status. So, what is called as transition finance in the last 2 years, I think it's been growing quite rapidly. And in that situation, if we look at the numbers, Japanese companies' transition financing accounts for a very large part in terms of the amount or value. 40% of transition financing is done by Japanese companies. On the other hand, if we look at the overall size of transition finance as a percentage of sustainable finance market, it's less than 1%. Transition finance accounts for only 1% of the overall sustainable financing market. So it has just begun. It's still in infantile stages. So why Japan? To explain the background, in Japan, as Ono-san just said, the government is developing an enabling environment which is quite effective. In conducting transition financing, verification becomes a key. So based on scientific basis or evidence, does the organization have a emission reduction plan? Does that not lead to greenwash or lock-in? We have to verify that. And in the case of Japan, as was mentioned earlier, there is a sectoral roadmap for several sectors. So as a financial institution, it is easier for us to verify the plan against the roadmap. It's easier for us to fulfill accountability. So because of that, it seems that Japan is ahead of some other countries in terms of transition financing. Now, if we look elsewhere around Asia, outside of Japan, it's different from one country to another. But when it comes to decarbonization strategy, there's a difference from one country to another. Some countries don't even have a strategy yet. So talking about decarbonization, we cannot take a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, because we will have to look at the political administration's policy for each country. So the pathway and taxonomy needs to be developed in consideration of the unique situation of that particular country. So decarbonization technology in one country may be applicable for transition finance, but the same technology may not be accepted as part of transition financing in another country. So with transparency and with a caution, we have to proceed in that regard, I think.
Thank you for that. We've heard from different perspectives and different standpoints the overview of transition finance in Asia. I think we were able to have an understanding of this. There are representatives from Japan and Europe, financial institutions and asset management companies here. So perhaps we could have them refer to their business and approaches to their business. And so we'd like to hear from Mr. Oshima again as MUFG Bank. How are you tackling transition finance, and where do you think are the commercial opportunities? Could you address this, please?
I think there's a slide that I prepared. If you could put that up, please. Is it on? Yes, this is the slide. Thank you. Well, in terms of what we're doing, our initiatives with respect to transition financing, well, there are 3 initiatives that I have described on this slide. But let me talk about what we're doing perhaps more broadly. Well, there are 3 as outlined here. One is NZBA, Net Zero Banking Alliance. So this is a group of banks, 116 banks around the world who are aspiring to achieve net zero. And as was mentioned earlier by Iwanaga-san, this started about a year and a half ago. Early on, there were lots of banks who talked about divestment quite extensively. But in the past 1.5 years, because of energy security issues and other issues, it's changed. So realizing net zero for the obligors that they lend to, that should be first and foremost the objective. And transition financing, achieving that could be one of the approaches that could be taken. And so MUFG is the chair of the working group for transition finance within NZBA. So that's one of the initiatives. And as you can see from the slide, there's a guidance for transition finance issued by NZBA, which came out last year. And in the middle, Asia Transition Finance Study Group. NZBA's initiative is made more practical and made more specific to Asia, where there seems to be more issues. So Asia's organizations and financial institutions, and we got much support from MATEI for this study group. So within this study group, we have been engaging in many discussions. In the case of Asia, when it comes to transition, people do understand that this is a big issue, but specifically how to address the issue of transition, people are somewhat at a loss. And so there were some difficulties, but a more practical guideline, a practical guidance was agreed upon at the end of last year, and it was published by this study group. And on the far right, this is an initiative unique to MUFG. It's called Transition White Paper by MUFG. And so from our perspective, we feel the need to transmit more information about this. So hard to abate sectors, especially materials, steels, paper and pulp, cement. For these companies, we collaborate with these companies to encourage them to engage. What kind of initiatives are they pursuing toward net zero? What kind of pathway do they have in mind? Well, specifically, we include the description of what they're doing in this white paper so that we can provide information about what Japanese companies are doing. And in last year's COP meeting, we brought this white paper to explain this to U.S. and European organizations. There are less specific deals, so we just wanted to determine the overall direction first. So upon formulating these guidelines, so that problems do not happen down the road.
Thank you for that. Japanese banks know Japanese businesses very well, so it's a very detailed approach which you are taking. We'd like to hear from Amundi, the representative and emblematic company of Europe. So, Mr. Iwanaga, please, could you show the slides, please? Could you turn to the second page, the page after the cover? The one after, the next to this page. Yes, that one. The theme today is transition, and we have a medium-term plan. which started on the 10th of 2021. Toward 2025, we have formulated this medium-term plan. There are three major areas. First, on management, product management strategy. We provide this to our customers. And the second area would be actually as issuers, engagement in issuers, to strengthen engagement with issuers. And the third area is that's about ourselves, through engagement to the issuer. What we propose is something that we have to do ourselves. We have to walk the talk, and that is what we've written here. And in terms of management, the light blue portion, there are several points I'd like to address here. The first point, going forward, between now and 2025, transition initiatives, we would like to relatively evaluate the progress, and we want to leverage this to build our portfolio. And that is what we're aiming to do. Presently, globally, we have 17,000 issuers, which we do ESG evaluation, comprehensive evaluation. This is unique to our company. And in addition to this transition approach evaluation, and for this purpose, we want to create an index. And in terms of providing to our customers, this is the fifth point. Auto sustainability, that's the fifth point. It's a portfolio platform. And the status of the portfolio can be grasped in a detailed manner. There are different climate-related factors, carbon footprint, SBTI. The companies that are invested in, are they well below middle, or are they properly aiming for 1.5 degrees centigrade, or this is a little bit intuitive. Portfolio temperature, that is the company, the business, if it goes at the present pace, the world's CO2, GHG reduction, what would be the temperature if the world proceeded at the company's pace? This would be one index to look at the portfolio situation, and we monitor the portfolio through this. This is something that we've developed, and we provide this to our customers. Please turn to the next page. This is engagement to our issuers, and what we're doing right now. We're still compiling figures for 2022. This shows the status of 2021. With regard to ESG, we have indices, and in our engagement, we look at these properly. Energy transition is one major theme, and we've worked on this for several years. And climate change-related engagement in this area in 2021, globally, 547 attempts were made. And as to what we have talked about, that's in the middle column. We talk about grasping the present status. And this is often said in TCFD, having a grasp of the present status going forward, what would be the target? And is that science-based? That is what we talk about here. This is how we approach our customers. And so when there is a proper disclosure, we can leverage this in our investment. That is why we emphasize this point. And in corporate governance, climate change, so that climate change is properly included in calculation of remuneration of board members or executives to include KPIs related to the climate. We are proposing that as well. And these are things that we do vis-a-vis issuers. And if we could go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm going into a little bit more detail. And we call this innovation. And most probably, climate change is such that there's a limit to what one company can do. Each company has its strengths, or there may be other entities that have better know-how. Then forming a partnership is the best way to go. Amundi, from the middle of the 2010s, we have been approaching this issue. In the top and in the middle row, IFC is indicated. We've partnered with IFC, International Finance Corporation, and in 2017, in emerging countries where financing is necessary, to create a market for green bonds. This is an initiative that we did together. And to local financial institutions, we have them issue green bonds. And for this purpose, we show them how to disclose the mannerisms, the customs that they have to follow. And then at the same time, we go to create markets. And under the present status, risk sharing is a scheme that we've included with IFC and with institutional investors' funds. 1.4 billion is the balance that we have at present. And the other is the environment and society. They are mutually influencing each other. So from internal combustion engines to EVs, to make that transition, there is some friction. Technology that used to be used can no longer be used, and there are people who are left behind, which we want to prevent. So a just transition is a concept which deals with this. Just transition approaches must be evaluated as well, and to invest in bonds issued by such issuers. This is what we're working on. And last but not least, to move back a page, AIIB. I have introduced AIIB here. That's initiatives with regard to climate change. We evaluate that, and then we created a framework for investment. Presently, AIIB in bond investment has created this. In the world of bonds, there's green bonds or label. The use of proceeds bonds. Investing in these bonds would be the best approach. But there are those that don't have this. The important part is the issuer's status of effort and procedures, and the physical risk and transition risk and the actual business portfolio. We look at this and we look at the business to see if it contributes to transition. We evaluate from these three perspectives. They may not have a perfect score for all. If the issuer is moving in the right direction, we would have created a framework where they could be considered for investment. And AIIB uses this for actual investment. And what's important is that to provide funds where people need it, and our know-how and the international institutions' know-how to combine these, and having done so, to work on the realization of a decarbonized society. That is the example of Amundi. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very concrete and beneficial. Thank you very much for the information. Time is passing very quickly. We'd like to move to the concluding part of this discussion. The major theme of the panel is how Tokyo can become the hub of Asia in transition finance, and how can we revitalize Tokyo for this purpose. We'd like to have proposals on this. And initially, we have had comments from the panelists. We want to share that, and we want to have everyone address this. Starting with Mr. Ono, please.
Thank you. To make Japan's practice Asia's practice. In my initial remarks, I talked about the Japanese transition finance being established and become rooted in the society, but Japan alone making efforts is insufficient. We have to spread this and make it a global, whole-of-planet effort. And last year, there had been many global initiatives through G20, OECD, COP27. Various discussions had taken place at the international level, but I believe the next focus should be Asia. Asia accounts for approximately half of GHG emissions around the world, and they continue to pursue rapid economic growth, and their dependency on fossil fuel is still high. So The key is how we can transform Asia to become carbon neutral, and that would have a big influence and implication to the global achievements of global net zero. MUFG, Oshima-san told that MUFG led the efforts in Asia and came up with the guidelines, but that's encouraging, but the concept of transition finance is still not so well known in Asia. So, of course, Japan has to do more, but I believe the next focus should be Asia, and we need to facilitate initiatives in Asia. So that's the key word. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Matei-san, please.
Yes, thank you. In the first part of my remarks, I discussed a bit the transition finance, the support to transition finance activities. So one avenue forward would be, of course, technological innovations in financial market, because this is, of course, of utmost importance for the future development of the financial sector, and for it to remain competitive and to offer better and better products to customers. So beyond support to transition finance activities, digital finance transition is equally important. And here I would like to say that it would be important to provide the right or the regulatory framework that is attractive for fintech companies or startups, which could support the financial market infrastructure in Japan and the development of new financial businesses. And I'd like to stress here that there is already substantial support from the Japanese government to what Tokyo could offer as a fintech hub. But going forward, progress on private sector initiatives that could spur, for example, consumer demand for fintech, and which could spur also innovation culture would be important. And let me mention in the end also the crypto market space, which where Japan has taken important policy measures, some of them quite recently. There is now growing awareness about the role, the big role that governments and regulatory bodies can play in this market. So in the EU also we have proposed a regulation, MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, which holds many similarities to the framework that is being developed in Japan. Here again, it would be important to deepen cooperation on regulatory approaches, including in the forums provided by international bodies, for example, the G20's FSB, Financial Stability Board. And the priority here, what is key, would be to establish clear regulations on user protection and to ensure that actually the users are protected, and also to promote stability in this industry. So here again, there is a big potential for Tokyo to become a digital asset capital.
Thank you very much. The concept of ecosystem is something very fresh, and I think it's very significant. Iwanaga-san, please. I'd like to talk about something that occurred to me when I was given this theme, financial human resources, a recurrent education thereof, including me. I think this is necessary. And to elaborate, finance up until now was such that perhaps economy was treated as economy, and economy boils down to the fact that where there's no market, it was considered externality, and we used to think of maximizing profit under such thoughts. But if we think about the future and sustainability, that concept will no longer do. So what we have learned in terms of economy and finance under a different premise has to be rebuilt, renewed, and I think it's very important that we do so. in the briefing for this panel, it was discussed that there are people. We need people from those people that didn't work in finance before. We need such new people, and we discussed that. And the layer of human resources, the thicker this is, and the more people that we have, I believe the importance and the significance increases and expands. And I thought of recurrent education for financial institutions. Thank you very much. There was a lot of discussion on that during a briefing. There are those who wrote about the environment, who joined an asset management company. So very interesting things are happening. And last, Oshima-san, please.
Yes. Mutual understanding among stakeholders. So that is my key phrase. The greatest hurdle in transition finance is for the stakeholders to have an understanding. So green financing, making investments and loans to renewables. When it comes to green financing, not many people would object, but transition financing, not necessarily the same. The hurdle may be higher. So a transition white paper that we put together, we use that to explain to European and U.S. stakeholders. We try to explain, but if we try to do it one way, it's hard to get the message across. But we talk about Europe, but there are many countries within Europe, between France and Germany, for example. Energy source composition is different. One country is different from another. So they do have an EU approach, but there are differences from one country to another. And so upon understanding that, we have to explain how our country is doing, what our country is doing. And by so doing, I think we may be able to gain gradual understanding on the part of others. And the rate of solar panel installation on flat ground in Japan is over 90%, not much flat ground left for solar panels. And we may think that there's lots of potential for offshore power, offshore wind power, but most of it will have to be the floating type, technically more difficult. And that is one of the reasons why we cannot transition all too easily, but we're going to still work on transition finance so that we can achieve carbon neutrality in 2030. So it's different from one sector to another, and we have to provide all the details while understanding the situation of the other countries and other regions. So that's important. So mutual understanding is key. And upon having mutual understanding, because transition finance has a large potential market, so by increasing transparency and consistency, we would like to appeal the attraction of Tokyo market to overseas investors and other communities.
Thank you very much. I have one proposal myself, actually. Could you show that on the screen, please? This is slightly different from the others. Creating a transition NISA in equity investment, preferential treatment is given by NISA, and that has been expanded largely, and that's a very subject of much discussion. Japanese NISA only targets shares, stocks. Japanese NISAs learned from Britain, and there's interest or deposit or bond NISAs. Why is it that only equity investment is preferred? There is a historical background, but as I mentioned at the outset, going forward, through things such as transition bonds, countries and businesses, when they issue bonds in large amounts, we need to educate investors, and that's a very realistic issue. And so through preferential tax system to promote transition bond purchases by individuals. It's a leverage of a tax system to meet national interests. I actually think this is a very superior method. And so I wish to stimulate that kind of discussion this year, and that is why I have raised this point. Time is nearly up. We still have a little bit of time, so I'd like to raise one question which was stimulated by your presentations. The session today was such that we discussed transition finance, decarbonization, transition finance, to be more specific. The world is looking at a broader concept, biodiversity conservation, or natural capital, cherishing more natural capital, and for the capital market in Japan. I think this will be a major theme this year. So biodiversity and finance, biodiversity and transition finance. From that perspective, what are the things that we should think about? Could you briefly address this and give your opinion? Iwanaga-san, please. Thank you very much. Here, we've just started to have an awareness of this, and how do we deal with this is something that we're working on. There are companies that we look at in evaluation, but investment strategy, in terms of investment strategy, we need to think about how do we confirm the present status and what metrics we need to use. In terms of climate, there is such a path, so I have explained that. In the same way, the actual disclosure guidelines to streamline that, we need to think about that in thinking about financial instruments. In the Ministry of the Environment, I'm sure you have an awareness of this issue. What is your take on this, please?
Thank you. Indeed. You have exactly said what MOE would have said. Thank you very much. In the biodiversity community, using global warming as one model, let's proceed with similar initiatives. Such momentum is on the rise, and at COP15 of last year, we had such a discussion, and the global goal was adopted. Biodiversity, it has TNFD, which is the counterpart of TCFD, and there will be more information disclosure based upon that framework. But in comparison to global warming, there are so many unknowns. It's complex. But so rather than waiting until a framework is set, until they make the initiative, already Japanese companies are spontaneously implementing their own initiatives. So entities should do what they could do already at this stage, and MOE hopes to support such entities.
Thank you. Please make sure you do the coverage as well. Oshima-san and Matei-san, we'd like to hear from you as well. So starting with Oshima-san, please.
Oshima, once again, thank you. With respect to biodiversity as well, it's a new challenge, shall I say. In COP15, we did send our colleagues to the conference from our bank, and those who participated said that it's going to take a lot of work. That's what they said coming back from the conference. Carbon neutrality perhaps is easier for financial institutions to understand as an approach, but when it comes to biodiversity, there is some awareness among some people, but what impact, where would that cause? What do we need to prepare? Work has just begun to consider that. So I think we need to accelerate our efforts.
Thank you. On this issue, the trends in EU cannot be ignored. So Matei-san, could you speak on this subject, please?
In the EU, we already started discussing this, and actually we plan to create incentives to finance or to boost nature finance, rather, including business investment. So we have a plan to double funding for biodiversity to 7 billion euros over the period 2021-2027. And at policy level, we already integrated biodiversity in our 2021 strategy for a transition to a resilient economy. And this means we already have in place disclosure and transparency requirements for companies and for financial market participants to follow. The EU taxonomy already includes criteria for biodiversity, and when finalized, the directive, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which already includes reporting on biodiversity, may become enter into force in 2025. So from that point on, we will indeed implement this format in all our legislation.
Thank you very much. We will continue to focus on the trends in EU, so please give us information. We'd like to end our panel discussion here, but finance is such that it is undergoing major changes. So financial markets, how do we find opportunities to revitalize the market? I think that is very important. That is what I've keenly felt through our discussion. The time was very short, but I think we had a very beneficial panel discussion. Thank you very much for listening. And could we have a big hand for the panelists, please? Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists and the moderator, Mr. Kodaira. Please step down from the stage.
Thank you
very much indeed.